Okay, so look, why don't I'm going to introduce Susan, and well, there's so much. I mean, that could be in itself at least an hour and a half presentation just about what she's done. No, I mean, an hour and a half would be the short version. So Susan has a really interesting background. But before that, Susan, we're going to do something which it might be unusual for you, but which is done in India and certainly done at Amrita University. And so we're going to say a prayer, okay, and or sing a prayer. So Malcolm, do you want to begin it or do it?
I would kindly ask. Okay. All right. Yeah, I can. Vaksayamritavarshini sumaduram sankirtanalapinim shamangim madhusikta suktim amritatmikam ishvarim.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as I said, it's probably not the standard fare for you, but here, nice. Yeah. So a few words about Susan. She began her PhD studies at the University of Pennsylvania and worked with the incredible Lila Gleitman, the one and only. She just had a birthday recently. She's in her 90s now, as I remember, and still bright as anything, the most amazing woman. One of the major figures in the field of language development. Just an amazing human being. And then Susan had the fun and the privilege of working with her and Heidi Feldman. And if I'm not mistaken, your PhD advisor was Rochelle Gelman.
It was both Lila and Rochelle.
Okay, and anybody who knows the field also knows that Rochelle is a major figure as well. So she really had quite a tutelage as a young academic. And she's now at the University of Chicago with an endowed chair. But yeah, so those are like some of the signposts, but let me tell you what she did, what I think she did, and she might disagree with me, but I'm pretty sure it's the case. And that is that she basically carved out a field, and people knew about what she was working on and what she let us know about. And people did what it is that she informed us about. It's about gestures, and she gave it a focus which people really hadn't thought much about before her work. So it's around gestures and cognition, but much more than that. And if I'm not mistaken, it started off with working with children with a very impaired hearing. They didn't get spoken language input from their parents, and the parents did not teach them sign language. They themselves didn't know, so they didn't sign. And these children created a system of gestures which it was similar to the structure of language, spoken language. That was pretty amazing as an idea. And when we talked about how is it that people are going to indicate that they have a question or not, so there's an icon of a hand being raised, which is a gesture. And Susan was looking at gestures, not in the form of icons, but in the form of what it is that people actually do. And afterwards, she started working with hearing people. And what she found is that gestures convey a huge amount of information if you know what to look for, and if you even think to look for it. And that information is actually is not necessarily the information that's revealed in the spoken language. And so it's not just a supplement. It's like language, and then there's something added onto it. But it has a life of its own, and it has a structure and meanings, which people had, as I said, not paid attention to before Susan's work. The last thing, and in some ways the most important, Susan is really a fine human being, and really a special person. And the times when we met, we're not in touch once a week or even once a month, but when we've met, I've always found a really decent and caring, open person. And it's not just the science that she's done, which is unusual, and it is, but it's also the personality that was behind discovering what we're going to be hearing today. So Susan, thank you very, very much again for getting up early in the morning for you, and for telling us about the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Sid. That was a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk today primarily about the second part that Sid mentioned, the part about hearing people and the gestures that they produce, and try to explore them and figure out what they're about. And so what I want to do to start is to just give you some idea of what I mean by gesture, because it's a word that's used very widely for many, many different things. So just let me begin. Whoops, no, it's not doing it. Oh, there it is. Okay, begin with an example. This is just a person, nothing special about him. He was asked about a moral dilemma. And what he does is he describes the controversy, the conflict, and he uses words that are pretty flowery. But if you look at his gestures, they're pretty clear. He talks about two different points of view that come into conflict, and then you have that moment of negotiation. So listen to him and watch him.
But cannot communicate verbally yet. He's only 4 months. And when I think about opportunities like this, where you have two interests that compete with one another, this is the point where people develop the skills of negotiation. Even with my young son.
Susan?
So, yes.
I don't know if you did share screen or not, but I didn't see the video that you just showed.
Really?
I saw
Yeah.
it. Sid, you may have your display in the sense maybe you're not seeing the presentation. It's
Okay. Okay, so it was me, and I'll figure out what to do.
I think you have to change your display so that you can see the presentation also. You may have your, just go to view, and then when you go to view, it gives you options.
You got it now, you're muted. Do others see it? Okay, well, let me go on, and I will, I got lots of videos, so I really want to make sure you guys can see the videos. That's, you know, when you talk about gesture, you really need videos. I was going to give you one other example, because the first one is very abstract. He's talking about moral reasoning or whatever, but we use gestures commonly in everyday interaction as well. And we all know that when we talk about space, how to get from one place to another, you really have to gesture. And this is the woman who was asked by Jana Iverson how to get from one place to another, and she describes.
Annalise, how about from home to Ashton?
Okay, well, Ashton, we go left and then out to 3rd, and then up to Jordan, then right again, and we go straight up to 10th Street, but we turn right on 10th. So Jordan is actually, which would be like right here, it's behind us instead of crossing into the library.
Mm-hmm.
So we go right, and then we cross a driveway, which is to right quad, and then cross a street.
So there is nothing unusual about this woman's gestures. She's gesturing just like everybody else does. But there is something a little unusual about her. And you'll notice that if you look at the little dog to her side. She's blind, and she's congenitally blind. She has never, ever seen anybody gesture. Nevertheless, she knows how to move her hands when she speaks. So it feels as though gesture is just integrally linked to our talk. So when we talk, even if we've never seen anybody move their hands, we will start to move our hands. So the question, of course, that I want to ask is whether these gestures are more than just hand waving. Sure, we move our hands, but does it do anything for us? And why do we do it? So the answer is yes, of course, otherwise it'd be a very, very short talk. Okay, so what I want to do to start is to convince you first, and I want to do this relatively quickly because this is old stuff, is to show you that gesture reflects knowledge, that you can look at gestures and know what the person is thinking, even if the person hasn't said it. But gesture then can tell us who's on the brink of change, because ideas that this person has that he's not expressing in speech may be able to help him learn. But I want to suggest also that gesture can do much more than that. It can actually change what we know. It doesn't just reflect what we know, it actually does the work to change it. And then finally, the part I'd like to spend most time on is to try to figure out what makes gesture a mechanism of change. Why does it work? We don't know the answer to it, but I will give you lots of thoughts that we've had about it, and we can talk about that. Okay, so first let's think about, or let me give you the evidence that suggests that gesture reflects knowledge. Why is it not going anymore? Okay, come on. All right, there it is. So we began, this is actually something I began with Rochelle Gelman. Rochelle Gelman had a videotape of herself doing Piagetian tasks. And I used to show that videotape in my classes all the time, my introduction to developmental psychology classes. And I noticed that when the kids were responding to these questions, they weren't just talking, they were gesturing. And so we began to look at the gestures. So what Piaget did, and Rochelle did too, is show a child 2 rows of checkers, ask them if the 2 rows have the same number, they say yes. Then you spread 1 row out, don't change the number, but you ask the child, does it still have the same number or not? And it's the non-conservers, the kids who are convinced that it's a different number, that I want to focus on. So here's a kid who is convinced it's a different number, and she says why, and she gives the same reasoning in her hands and her mouth. She says, you spreaded them out.
Yes. Do these 2 rows of checkers have the same number of checkers? No. Which row has more checkers on it? Now, why does it have more checkers in it?
You spread them apart and this would stay like you put them down.
Okay, so she's produced what we've come to call a gesture-speech match, in the sense that she's talking about spreading and she's gesturing about the motion of spreading. So the same information roughly. It's never exactly the same, but roughly. But this child is quite different. He also thinks they're different, and he says, you moved them. But what he does with his hands is to pair up the gestures in 1 row with the gestures in another row. And that's quite clever, because that's getting to the beginning of conservation.
Rows have the same number of checkers in them now. Why is there a different number in rows?
Because you moved them.
Okay, that's not the way you move them. That is pairing the checkers up. So this child has produced what we call a mismatch. He's talking about moving like the other one, but he's gesturing about one-to-one correspondence. So we thought, when we found kids like this, that maybe they might know more about conservation, even though they didn't know they knew it. And if we gave them instruction in conservation, they might be able to advance more than kids who only produced matches. So we gave children, all non-conservers, instruction, and then we looked to see how many of them improved. And what you see here is the proportion of children who improved on the post-test. And in the blue bar, you have people who are mismatchers before instruction. And in the white bar, you have people who are matchers before instruction. And mismatchers were more likely to learn, which suggests they were more ready to learn conservation than the matchers. Okay, so this is true of conservation, 5 to 8-year-olds. Is it true of anything else? So we went to another task to look at, and this is a math task. It seems very simple, 3 + 4 + 5 = blank + 5, but in the United States, at least, 4th graders get it wrong. Pretty universally. And when they get it wrong, what they do is either they add up all the numbers on the right side of the problem, left side of the problem and put that number in the blank, or they add up all the numbers in the problem and they put that number in the blank. Okay. But, as we all know, I hope, even though it's late for you, what the answer is 7. You add up the 3 and the 4, you put that in the blank. Okay. So here's a child. Whoa, why do we go back? Okay, here's a child who put 12 in the blank. She added up all the numbers on the left side of the problem. And she says she does that, and she gestures that as well.
How did you get 12 as your answer?
Okay, so she points at the 5. She points at the 5 and the 4 and the 3. Okay, and she talks about that. Okay, so she's produced a match.
Baker, please turn off your mic, please. Baker, please mute yourself.
Okay, so she's produced a match because she's adding up the numbers to the equal sign in gesture and in speech. Now, this one's a little different. She says exactly the same thing. I added up the 5 and the 4 and the 3, but watch her carefully, because what she does is she points at the first 5 and then the second 5 and then the 4 and the 3. So she's gesturing about adding up all the numbers, but talking about adding up a different set.
I added 5 and then the 4 and then the 3 too.
So she's produced a mismatch again. She's talking about adding up numbers to the equal sign, gesturing about adding up all of the numbers in the problem. And when we gave children like this who didn't know how to solve the problem instruction, again, we found there's the conservation data, here's the mathematical equivalence data. The children who were mismatchers prior to instruction were the ones who were ready to learn, okay, the ones in blue. Okay, so what this means really is that gesture is conveying substantive information about a speaker's thoughts. It's not gesturing or not gesturing. They're all gesturing. It's what they're gesturing, what they're saying with their gestures, and how that relates to their speech. And what's most interesting to me is some of the thoughts that they express are not in gesture, are not expressed in speech. So if you just listen to these children, you wouldn't know that they know what they know. So you got to look at them. Okay. So now the next question is, can gesture change our minds? And the way we tried to explore this was to look first to see whether the gestures we see can change our minds, and then whether the gestures we produce can change our minds. So what we had to do was to manipulate the gestures children see. So we had 3 groups: kids who got no gesture, kids who got gestures that matched, and kids who got gestures that were not the same, that mismatched. And we gave them one strategy in speech. It was an equivalent strategy, which I will explain in a minute. So the first group got just the equal equivalent strategy in speech. The second one got it in speech and in gesture. And the third one got an equivalent strategy and an add-subtract strategy that I will illustrate in a minute. But if you notice, the mismatching gesture actually has more information in it. It has 2 different strategies. The matching only has 1. So to control for that, we also gave some groups 2 strategies in speech, and the EQ and S and EQ in speech and add subtract in speech equates for the amount of information that children are getting. And then we just finished out the protocol to make it even. Okay, so this now is an example of a child who got no gesture, equivalence only in speech. So listen.
Solve this by adding 7 + 8 + 5, which equals 20. And then we want to make the other side of the equal sign the same amount. So 15 + 5 also equals 20. So 15 would be the answer. So now I want you to try solving it.
Okay, so this next one is that she says exactly the same thing. And what she's emphasizing in her speech and in her gestures, that there are two sides of the problem that are equal. So she does the same thing on the two sides of the problem with her hands.
That is, we can add 6 plus 8 plus 4, which equals 18. And then we want to make the other side of the equal sign the same amount. So 6 plus 12 also equals 18. So 12 would be the answer. So now I want you to try solving.
Okay, now here's the third one. This she gave, again, she says exactly the same thing, but this time what she does is she gives a different strategy. She points at the 7, the 8, and the 5. And then on the other 5, she does a little takeaway gesture. Because if you add up all the numbers on the left side and take away the one that's the same, 5, what you get is the right answer. So it's an add subtract strategy. So watch this.
Another way we can solve this. And that is, we can add 7 plus 8 plus 5, which equals 20. And then we want to make the other side of the equal sign the same amount. So 15 plus 5 also equals 20. So 15 would be the answer. So now I want you to, let me show you.
So notice that she's not talking about taking away. She's only gesturing about taking away. So what we did is we gave 20 children, roughly 20 children in each group, these instructions. And then we looked to see how much they learned. So we gave them a post-test. And this is the data from the post-test. First, I want to compare one strategy in speech to two strategies in speech. Because often what they say in education is that you should give more different strategies in your instruction, because some children might like one and some children might like another. These are all correct strategies, and maybe that will work better. But in this instance, it really didn't. If you gave them two strategies in speech, it sort of blew them away. They just were unable to really cope with it. One strategy in speech was much, much better. So what I'm gonna do now is break up these two bars into the gesture. So what you see here is one strategy in speech, two strategies in speech, mismatching gesture in red, matching gesture in blue, no gesture in white. And what's most interesting here is that the red bars are the highest. It was surprising to us. We actually, when we went into this, we thought, okay, if you get gesture that matches speech, that's going to reinforce the speech and you're going to do great. And it better than if you get no gesture at all. If you get a mismatching gesture, hard to know what to predict. It might be really bad. But in fact, it's the best instruction that we gave them. And it's interesting because it's not like two strategies are bad. It's only two strategies in speech that's bad. If you have a strategy in speech and a different one in gesture, that's really effective instruction. So that was surprising to us. But let me give you an example of what that really looks like. What I'm really arguing here is that gesture is powerful, not necessarily that it's wonderful, because you can sometimes lead people astray with your gestures. So here's an example of a 7 plus 6 plus 5 equals blank plus 5. The child puts 18 in the blank. And what the teacher says is, oh, you added up these three numbers to get your answer. And she points at the 7, 6, 5, and the other 5. So she does a mismatch. In this case, she produces an add-all mismatch. And what happens then is the child says, put 23 in the blank. And if you look carefully, if you add up all of the numbers that she pointed at, you get 23. Let me show you what this looks like.
Is that what you're indicating? So you get this answer by adding these three numbers.
So she pointed at that last 5, and that set him off.
You see, there's like 5 here, right? You see? So if we put 13, then we have to add 13 plus 5, and that's more than this. You see? Because they have to be equal, right? So 7 plus 6 plus 5 has to be the same as 20. You want me to put 23 here?
What's sort of charming about this example is, she has no idea where 23 came from. And it may have come from who knows where, but it is likely it came from her hands and the child picked that up. So just to show you that this is not just about math, we've also done some studies looking at eyewitness testimony. So we know that in a testimony, in an interview, when you ask a child a question, you're not supposed to ask him a leading question. So you're not supposed to ask, what color was the hat he was wearing? Because then kids are likely to tell you that somebody's wearing a hat, even if he wasn't. You're supposed to say, what was he wearing? And then if the child says the hat, it's really that the child said it's a hat and saw it and believes it. So what we did was we brought in a musician. The musician was in the classroom. We knew exactly what the musician did. And then we interviewed the children. And this is Sarah Broaders, who's interviewing the child. And what she does is she asks a perfectly good open-ended question. What else was he wearing? Now, all you have to know really is that the musician was not wearing a hat. So watch what happens.
Okay, what else was he wearing?
A music hat.
A music hat? Was he wearing anything else that you can remember?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Queen.
A green hat?
Oh, queen.
A queen hat.
And cowboy hat too.
Okay, so where did all those cats come from? I mean, and if you look at her carefully, she is asking a great open-ended question, but watch her. Come on.
Okay, what else was he wearing?
She did a hat gesture. And actually, doing an open-ended question with a hat gesture misled the children just as much as saying, what color was the hat he was wearing? So our gestures really are powerful. We definitely do change our minds as a function of other people's gestures. And they can sometimes be used for good, but sometimes they're used for evil. Okay, so gestures we see can change our minds. How about the gestures that we produce? So in order to do that, to explore that, we had to manipulate the gestures that learners produce. And we taught the kids to say these words. I want to make one side equal to another side, which is an equalizer strategy. They were told to say these words before and after solving each problem in the training. So here's an example of a kid, no gesture, just speech.
I'll take one side and go to the other side.
Okay. Another group was taught to say exactly the same thing, but to also produce a gesture, to do an equalizer gesture with their hands. Equalizer gesture in speech, but a grouping strategy in gesture. Now, grouping strategy, she points her under the 3 and the 2, and then points at the blank because they're equal addends, you can add these two numbers up and put the number in the blank. So here she goes.
So first of all, can you say the words and do the hand movements exactly like we practiced?
One side and put to the other.
Okay.
So in a way, she's saying one thing and doing another. But one difference between the gesture and the no gesture, or the first two groups, is that one's gesturing, one's not. So we decided also to have a group where it's partially correct. So what we told them to do is say the equalizer and point at the wrong two numbers and put that in the blank. Okay, so here he goes.
Exactly how we practiced.
One side equal to the other side.
Okay.
So we had thought that teaching him to do that would be a total disaster because we're pointing at the wrong two numbers. But notice that there is something about the gesture that is correct in that he's dividing the problem up into two. So he's splitting it at the equal sign. And he's also doing a grouping gesture with his hands, which is giving him partial information about the problem. So it's not a total, might not be a total disaster. Okay, so here, then they all got the same lesson. We actually did teach them. We didn't just sort of let them loose at that point. And all three groups got the same lesson. And this is what happened. This is the mean number of problems correct on the post-test. They all were 0 on the pre-test. If they got correct gesture on the right, they did the best. If they got certainly better than no gesture, and better than if they had partially correct gesture. But interestingly, if they had the partially correct gestures, they're better than no gestures, which is sort of interesting because it's not just that gesture is pointing out the right things. It's telling you more. It's not just grabbing your attention. It also conveys real information. Okay, so the kids, we argue, were extracting meaning from the gestures that they themselves produced. Because they began, and we knew that because they began producing the grouping strategy in speech for the very first time after the instructions. So here's an example of a kid never said grouping before, was told to produce grouping in his gestures, and this is what he said after the instruction. And I wrote it out on the bottom because he's hard to hear.
Because the 6 and this 6, since there's 2 6, I know so I shouldn't use this one, so I added these two.
So he's really got it. He's understanding that there's equal addends and what to do about it. Okay, so during this lesson, the experimenter never produced grouping in either gesture or speech, and the children only produced grouping in their gestures, not in speech. So what we're arguing here is that grouping came from the children's own gestures. All right, so gesture reflects knowledge. It can change knowledge in a lot of different ways. What makes gesture a mechanism of change? We don't really know, as I said, but we have a bunch of hypotheses. Now, one of the things that is so salient, so obvious about gesture is that it's action. I mean, it is movement. And maybe people have talked about embodied cognition. Maybe gesture works really well because it's action. And in some sense, it does. And in 3 ways, I want to argue. It engages the motor system in listeners, obviously in speakers. It leaves a motor signature in speakers, and it adds action information to our representation. So let me give you evidence for all 3 of those. And then what I'm going to do is say that action is not the whole story. So here we go. Okay. Gesture engages the motor system, not only when you speak, obviously when I'm moving and I'm gesturing, my motor system is involved. But what I want to argue is that you sitting there listening to me, if you're also watching me, you're engaging your motor system because I'm gesturing. Okay, so how do we do that? So what we did is we developed this paradigm where we had people listen to words. So to put the towel back in its place. Now, if you have a sentence like that, you could imagine that the towel was either on a hook or maybe it was on a shelf. And when you hear that sentence, you have no idea which it is. But if you hear the sentence with a gesture, you're biased in one direction or the other. So if you hear this,
the girl put the towel back in its place.
You're going to imagine that the towel was on a hook, and this is going to be the congruent picture. But if you hear this, whoops, this one.
The girl put the towel back in its place.
Okay. You're going to imagine that this one is the congruent picture, and the towel on a hook is the incongruent picture. So we're trying to bias how they interpret things by giving them gesture. Of course, this is assuming that they're understanding the gesture. So what we did then is just to look at how quickly they identify. What they were supposed to do was say, is there a towel? Is this word that is said in the speech, towel, is it in the picture? And the answer is yes in both cases. But how quickly they responded yes differed as a function of whether the picture was congruent or incongruent. This is our reaction time. So lower is better than if the picture was incongruent. Okay, fine. That just sets us up for being able to ask the question that I want to ask. Our hypothesis was that listeners activate their own motor systems when they process a speaker's gestures. And if they do, then maybe loading up the motor system involved should affect how gesture is processed. So we made people either move their hands in funny ways or in random ways, or move their feet in random ways. And we expected moving your hands to get in the way, moving your feet not. Okay, if the motor system is involved. So we asked people to move their arm and leg movements. Here's an example of, and we just told them to move, any way they wanted. So here's arm and leg movements, hand and arm movements. This woman was very delicate. She just, sort of almost like a little dancer. They weren't all like that. So I'll show you the second one too. She was much more mundane. Yes. In the way she moved around. And this is a foot and leg movement. They did whatever they wanted, but they had to plan some movement. Okay, and then we gave them exactly the same study again. And when they moved their arms, as we predicted, the phenomenon went away. But when they moved the legs, it had no effect. So what we're suggesting here is that arm movement is involved. And when you listen, And when we screw it up, when we make you move your arms, this whole effect goes away, which really does suggest that your motor system is involved when you watch me gesture. Okay. So that's what I just said. Motor systems involved not only in producing your own gestures, but also in understanding the gestures others produce. All right. So gestures action, it engages the motor system in listeners. It leaves a motor signature in speakers. So we did this looking in the same way. People have looked at action, and action leaves a motor signature. If you've learned something by doing it, then later on, when you're asked to solve the problem, even if you're not acting, your brain, the motor areas in your brain are activated. So children who learn by acting on an object, for example, writing letters, establish neural representations in the motor areas. This is work by Karen James. So these motor areas are activated when children are asked to process the letters without acting on them. So they learned it by action. Then later on, when they're tested on the numbers, their motor areas are activated, even though nobody's acting. So we wanted to see whether that was true for gesture. So,
Susan,
yes.
We would have a question just identified in the chat box from Dr. Bhavani. She's asking, does this mean that the restless leg syndrome does not impact attention? She has a very particular question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you say it again? I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Does this mean that the restless leg syndrome does not impact attention? Dr. Bhavani, kindly.
No, when you said that when moving the legs does not really impact things, so I was wondering, because I tend to shake my legs whenever I'm listening to something. So, and people always tell me that that's a distraction. So may I assume that it's not a distraction when I move my legs and I'm listening to something?
It's not a distraction for you. It may be a distraction for them. They don't like it. But it's not messing up your cognition is what I would argue. So you can move your legs, just don't let them see. I tend to do it too. Okay, so we went to fMRI to look at this question, to ask whether learning through gesture leaves a motor signature. And we taught the kids either a speech alone response or speech plus gesture. Here's the speech alone.
One side equal to the other side.
Or speech plus gesture, they're all the same here.
One side equal to the other side.
Okay, so that's how they learned. They all learned. So everybody came to Criterion. They all learned how to do it. And then a week later, we brought them back and put them in an fMRI, in a scanner, and we asked them questions. And then there was no action involved at all. So they get a problem, 4 plus 2 plus 2 equals blank plus 2. And they had to think about the answer. And when they were ready, push the go button. And then they had to decide whether the answer they thought of was the same answer as was displayed there. Push green if it was, red if it wasn't. Okay, so all they're doing is that, and they're not moving. Everybody's just pushing buttons, but they're not moving in the same way at all. And what we found is that the kids who were taught in speech and gesture activated their motor areas, the same motor areas, pretty much that Karen James finds, more than the speech alone, which suggests that, once again, gesture is acting like an action. And this is the motor network that Karen James finds. So it's pretty comparable, although not totally identical, which is something that we're exploring now. So you're learning through gesture, it leaves a motor signature. But as I just said, the activated areas are not completely overlapping. And we're trying to now explore the ways in which it's not overlapping, because action and gesture are not identical, as I'll keep talking about. I'll get there. Okay. So gesture adds action information to our representations. Our hypothesis was that when you gesture, it's adding information to your own mental representations, additional information. So if the act of doing something is changing what you're thinking, you may be sort of doing it mindlessly, but eventually it's going to feed back and affect how you behave. That's not an easy hypothesis to prove. So I'll show you this and see if you're convinced. So if this is true, people's thoughts about a task ought to change in predictable ways if they gesture, not necessarily if somebody else gestures. So we use the Tower of Annoy paradigm. That's, I think most of you know what this is, but it's 3 poles and you get a stack of discs. And what you're supposed to do is move the discs to one pole, you have a goal, and you're only allowed to move one disc at a time, and you can never put a big one on top of a little one. Okay, so it's a logical puzzle. So we asked them to do this, and they had real weighted discs. So the biggest disc had to be lifted with 2 hands. Okay, then we said, all right, now explain what you did. So we had them talk. And, you know, when you talk about Tower of Annoy, you can't talk about Tower of Annoy without gesturing. So watch this. She's great.
And then, so there was 4 discs on this peg. And so then I moved the top disc. They were in this order from big to small, from bottom to top. And so I moved the top smallest disc to the middle. And then I moved the second.
Okay, so she's gesturing. Now, then we had them, so they did it, they explained it, then they did it again. And one group got exactly the same tower, and they did everything again. The other group that we called the switch group, we gave them a new tower. It looked exactly the same, but now the little one was so heavy, you had to lift it with 2 hands, and the big one was really light. So we've just changed the weights of the discs, but not how they looked. All right, so then we, now, one thing I want to tell you is that some people, when they explained it, talked about the little disc and gestured about it with a single hand. This is just like what the woman you saw did. Okay, so here she goes.
And so I moved the top smallest disc to the middle.
Okay, she's gesturing about it with 1 hand. Others just gestured about it with 2 hands.
The smallest disc on the top and putting it on the middle.
Okay, and so they differed in how they gestured about the smallest disc. Now, what happened then is this is the difference score between the second trial and the first trial. And I guess not surprisingly, you know, lower is worse. The people in the switch groups, I'm sorry, lower is better because they're faster. The people in the no switch groups improved over time because they're doing exactly the same thing. The people in the switch group have a new task, and they're slower. But we could predict who in the switch group was better and who was worse. So what you see here is that on the x-axis, we have the percent of one-hand gestures. And on the y-axis, we have the change in solution time. So the more one-handed gestures you used, the worse you were. Why? Because if you're using one hand to represent moving this, and then you get a very heavy disc that you can't lift up with one hand, you're sort of setting yourself up for failure because you can't lift it that way. If you do 2 hands for your gesture, it doesn't matter if it's heavy or light or whatever, it doesn't matter at all. And in fact, if you got 2, if in the no switch group where it didn't matter at all, there was no effect of how many hands you used in the gesturing. So it looks like the gestures that you produce in between the 2 sessions, in between the 2 tests, affect how you behave on the second test. Now, maybe one thought is that gesturing is reflecting the adult's knowledge rather than changing it. You know, this young woman who used 1 maybe is thinking of it as light. The guy who used 2 is maybe thinking of it as small. And so they gesture accordingly. So, but if gesture changing the knowledge, we should find differences between switch and no switch only when the adults gesture. What we had wanted to do was to ask them to not gesture at all and to explain, but we couldn't do that because if you're asked to explain, you have to gesture. So we took the explanations out entirely, and they did it once and then they did it twice. And so they didn't have any explanations to do, and they didn't gesture. So what happens? So now they're not gesturing. If gesturing is causing this change, if gesturing is just reflecting what they're thinking, the results should look the same as before. If gesturing is changing the way they think, then it should look different. And what happens? It looks different. So the data on the right is what I showed you before when they gave explanations. The data on the left is when they didn't give explanations. And the guys who were in the no switch groups did just as well as the kids. Guys in the switch group did just as well as the kids in the switch and the no switch group. And what's interesting here is that you would think that in the switch, you would always do worse because it's a different task. Why shouldn't it be? But The switch in weights is an impediment only when the adults gesture. Only when they gesture. And notice that the weight of the group of the discs is not relevant to this problem. This is a logical problem. So why would you talk about the weight? If you do talk about the weight, it shouldn't affect how you solve the problem, but it does, because when you gesture about the weight, nobody talks about the weight, by the way. Okay. So gesturing adds information to our mental representations of a task. If the action information is compatible with the right answer, then performance is facilitated. But if not, as in this Tower of Annoy case, performance suffers. And as I just said before, weight is irrelevant to solving this problem. No one mentions it in speech, but you cannot not mention it in gesture, because either I'm using one hand or two hands if I'm gesturing at all. I don't have a choice but to bring weight in. And in this instance, bringing weight in can be hurtful, and we bring it in with our gesture. So gesture isn't always good for you. It just is powerful. Okay. Now, one last little point about this before I move on is gesture can be more powerful than action is. So what we did is we did the same thing again, but this time instead of one group did exactly the same thing. They did it, they explained it, they did it again. This next group, they did it again, and then they did it again. We wanted to do action. And so we're trying to see whether just acting is doing the same thing that gesture is doing. And what you see is that action is quite different. So gesture is different from action. There's something about bringing in, I think it's because gesture is representational. It brings in ideas, it talks about ideas, whereas action doesn't. Okay, so gesture's mechanism. Yep.
If I may interrupt you, based on our agreements in the beginning, we have here another question in the chat box from Dr. Praveen. He's asking, could it also be possible that the ones who are using only one hand are for some reason not using their entire brain, and for that reason is affecting the task? ?
So they're not using their entire brain. That's certainly possible, but I would think then that I don't know why that would make a difference if they weren't gesturing. That is, if they didn't give explanations. So it has to be in some way tied to the explanations, because when we take the explanations away, the effect goes away. So I don't know why it is. I mean, it could be just that they're using less of their brain, but it has to be tied to the explanations, because when we take them away and they're not gesturing anymore, then the effect goes away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm giving the question to Dr. Praveen. Is that, would you like to add something to that, or is the question answered?
I was just wondering, for some of the children whom we have studied, like they are inherently having a difficulty in gesturing, and we have seen that there is a difficulty in learning as well. So I was just wondering if, for some reason, the children that you were looking at have a difficulty in, you were talking about two hands and single hands. So it's just, that's the rationale behind the question.
Yeah, that's a good question. These are actually adults that we were dealing with, but we do have some studies of children who have brain injury, and this is looking at their spontaneous communication, and they have sort of problems using both hands, so they gesture with only one hand. But in some senses, some places they are slower than the kids who are typically developing. So the gesturing, I think that's a really nice place to look to see whether gesturing really matters. Most instances, their language and whatever is right on target, but in some instances it's not. And I can give you references for that if you like. It's the work done by Sheda Oshkalaspan. Okay, so let me move on and just tell you why I think that the reason gesture works is in part because it's action, but that the story is more complicated. And it's complicated in three ways, at least three ways. Gesture leads to generalization, and action doesn't. I'll give you evidence for this. Gesture represents information, and action doesn't. and gesture's tied to speech and action isn't. So those are three ways in which gesture might be a little bit more special, sorry about my dog, than action is. So first it leads to generalization. So gesture's grounded in action, but at the same time it represents information. And it has the potential to get learners to transition from being fully grounded in something to being more abstract. And I'm trying to argue that gesture's somewhere here with legs in both the action and in the representation. And so maybe we can help them move from here to there by using gesture. So that's the argument. So what we did was taught them the same words. I want to make one side equal to the other side. And we gave them 3 different groups. They got 3 different actions. Either they got action, concrete gesture, or abstract gesture. I'll show you what that is. So this is the action. They're supposed to be doing the grouping strategy in action. So watch what they are taught to do. So they literally pick up the numbers, they hold them in their hand and group them, and they put them in the blank. I mean, this is a real literal interpretation of grouping. These are the concrete gestures.
I want to make one side equal to the other side.
So it's exactly the same thing, but they don't move the numbers. And the third one is more abstract, what you saw before.
Equal to the other side.
Okay, so these are 3 different groups. They got 3 different trainings. And then we gave them a post-test. And the post-test had 3 different types of problems on it. The first type was they got a test really that was just like the problems on which they were trained. So 5 plus 2 plus 8 equals blank plus 8. The next problems they got were exactly not the same numbers, but that's the number that was the same was in exactly the same spot. And the way to solve that is you had to group the first 2 addends. So that's really just, did you learn anything? And as it turns out, everybody learned something. So in all 3 groups, this is the proportion of children who succeeded. And in all 3 groups, they learned. So even giving them this crazy little picking up the numbers and moving it, it didn't get in their way. Everybody learned as a function of those activities in the action condition, the concrete gesture condition, and in the abstract condition. But then we also gave them a near transfer test. So here what we did was we took that number that was the same on the two sides of the equation and we moved it so that it was the beginning of the problem and right before the blank on the right side. So now if you point at the first 2 numbers, you're not going to get the right answer. So you really have to understand something about why you're grouping and what you're grouping in order to solve this correctly. Okay, so now what happens? So what we find is that now the action group drops off. So we're asking them to transfer. And if you gestured either a concrete gesture or an abstract gesture, you could transfer. But if you did the action, you didn't. So what we see here is the proportion of children who succeeded, and not very many in the action group, but many in the other groups succeeded. And the last question we asked, we took away the equal addends entirely, and now you had to really understand equivalence and sort of figure out a strategy for solving it. And then actually even the concrete gesture is starting to drop off, and the abstract gesture is the best for transfer. So what this is suggesting is that action helps kids learn the problem on which they're taught, but gesture helps them extend that knowledge to new problems, which I think is extremely important and potentially very useful for our education, because we know that, I mean, that's the name of the game here. We got to get them to generalize, to move away from what they're taught, to move to something else. And I'm suggesting that gesture might be able to really help about this. So we replicated this effect in toddlers learning new words via action versus gesture, and found exactly the same thing, that gesture and action both help learning words, but gesture helped them generalize the words. So it seems like it's not just about math. Okay, come on, move. All right, next. Gesture represents information, action doesn't. Okay. So we had 2 hypotheses here. Why does gesturing lead to change? One is a possibility. It offers a second modality. You're using your mouth, you're using your hands, multimodalities. That's been shown to be effective. And maybe that's why. But another possibility is that it offers a second, different representational format. Because when you produce things in your mouth, it's sort of discrete and categorical. Language is categorical. It has gradient components, but for the most part, it's categorical. But gesture is much more imagistic. It draws pictures in the air. It's much more iconic and imagistic. Okay, so we have in hearing people, they're talking in a categorical way, a discrete way, but they're gesturing in an imagistic way. And we have two different representational formats happening at the same time. And that's the way it is for hearing people. But what we can do is look at deaf people, because deaf signers gesture. Karen Emery showed this ages ago, and they produce their gestures in the same modality. So they have one modality, but they do have two representational formats. Their gestures are also more imagistic and their signs are categorical. So here we can test whether it's modality or representational format. If it's modality, all the effects I've shown you about gesture shouldn't work for signers. If it's representational format, it should. That's the logic. Okay, so although signers don't use two modalities, they use one to communicate, but they do use two representational formats. And we asked two questions. Do signers produce gesture sign mismatches? What does that even mean? And do those mismatches predict readiness to learn? So we went back to the math problem, and here's a deaf child using sign and a matching gesture to explain how she solved the problem. She got it wrong. So what she says is she added all, and she signs that, but she also points at all four numbers. So in both sign and gesture, she's talking about adding all. So I'll deconstruct that for you. In her sign strategy, she says add all. And in her gesture strategy, she sweeps from left to right, and then she points at, and then she actually it's right to left. And then she points at all four numbers. Okay. So we find then that the children gesture. 80% of the problems that the children solved, they gestured on. Is that a lot or a little? We had absolutely no idea. So we went back to our hearing kid data and looked at the same numbers. And it turns out hearing kids gesture about the same amount, so 73%. So fine, we're in the right ballpark. The deaf kids gesture as much as the hearing kids. Now, do they ever produce mismatches? So here's an example of a mismatch. What the child does is she talks about adding up the numbers on the left side of the problem and putting that number in the blank. So it's an add to equal sign. But with her other hand, she gestures, taking away the 7, the equal number, the addend that is the same on both sides of the problem. So she's producing two strategies at the same. Take a look. Same time. Okay, I'll deconstruct that one too. It's fast. So in sign, she adds it all up and she puts it in the blank. In gesture, what she does is she adds them up, but she also takes away the 7, which is an add subtract strategy. So it's different information. And this isn't a sign. Everybody will agree that this is not a sign. All signers are great. Okay. So the proportion of children who produce 3 or more mismatches, 42%, same or different. We looked at the hearing kids, and it's roughly the same. But now, all right, so fine, they will produce mismatches, but do those mismatches predict learning? So this is a crucial question. So what we did is we divided up the kids, these are the deaf kids, as a function of how many mismatches they produced prior to instruction. And what I've shown you in the bottom there is the number of children. So you had 0 mismatches, there were 8, 1 mismatch of 12, 3, and our prediction is that the more mismatches you produce before instruction, the better you're going to do after instruction. And this is what we found. They were all at 0 to start. And to be called successful, you had to produce 5 out of 6 problems correctly. And as you can see, the more mismatches the children produced prior to instruction, the better they did. Now, is that the same or different from the hearing kids? These are the data I showed you at the very beginning from the hearing kids. And these are the data from the deaf kid in the same format. And it's very, very comparable. So what this suggests is that it predicts gesture sign mismatch, predicts learning as well as gesture speech mismatch does. But it's not because it's hand and mouth. That's not what's going on in sign. It's really the juxtaposition of two different representational formats rather than the juxtaposition of two different modalities that makes gesture powerful. Okay, so last point. Gesture is tied to speech and action isn't. You can certainly talk and act at the same time, and you can even talk about what you're acting on, but gesture really is integrally tied to speech. So what we tried to do was to take it apart and have instances where gesture and speech are coinciding, but also have gesture and speech separated to see if that made a difference. So here what we have is equalizer and speech and add subtract at the same time. You've seen this before in another study, but I'll show you the example.
So we can solve this problem by adding 7 plus 8 plus 5, which equals 20. And then we want to make the other side of the equal sign the same amount. 15 plus 5 also equals 20. So 15 is the answer.
So that's what the children saw in the instruction. Here's another group, we split it. And she talked equalizer and then gestured add subtract. So watch this.
So we can solve this problem by adding 7 plus 8 plus 5, which equals 20. And then we want to make the other side of the equal sign the same amount. 15 plus 5 also equals 20. Okay? So watch my hands. So 15 is the answer.
So when I look at that, I actually, in a way, find it easier than looking at the gesture and speech together because it's taking it apart. So we wanted to see whether that was as good as, better, worse than gesture and speech together. And as a control, what we did was we had two speech strategies, equalizer in speech and add subtract in speech, which you can imagine. So I won't show that to you.
Okay.
Okay. So what happens? We looked at retention over time. And we looked at immediately after training, 1 day after training, and 4 weeks after training. And the immediately after training, this just replicates the data that I showed you earlier, that speech with gesture, that mismatching gesture, that red bar before was better than speech alone, which is speech then speech. Okay. We also did it 1 day after training and 4 weeks after training. What's sort of interesting is that if anything, the gesture effect is getting stronger. That's not the first time we found this, actually. It feels like gesture is the gift that keeps on giving. It just gets stronger and stronger and stronger over time, whereas the speech, if anything, is getting lower. Now, the crucial question is what happens when you get speech and then gesture? Does it look like the white bars or does it look like the red bars? And as it turns out, it looks like the white bars. It doesn't have as a big an effect as speech with gesture. So what this suggests is that at least when you're watching it, putting the two together, which feels more complicated, is more effective than pulling the two apart. We also looked at generalization immediately after training. This is sort of right away. And this is the data I showed you before. On the trained problems, everybody's sort of the same, but in the near transfer problems, the speech with gesture starts to get better. And in the far transfer problems, it's much better. That's true 1 day after training. If anything, the effect is more pronounced, and 4 weeks after training, it's again more pronounced. So as I said before, gesture is the gift that keeps on giving. It just keeps making things stronger. So the two representational formats that gestures are providing, or one of them along with speech, work best when they occur simultaneously, which is a little counterintuitive. And I think we need to think about why. What's the cognitive mechanisms that underlie that make that happen? Okay. So just to summarize, and then we can have a discussion. The gestures we produce provide a window onto our thoughts. I think that is pretty clear because the information conveyed in gesture is telling us something about what's going on. They not only reflect what we know, they can influence what we know. So that means you have to be a little careful about how you move your hands because it is changing your mind in some sense. And gesture is an act of the body, which may really be important. I don't want to minimize that. But it could be the body's representational potential, its potential to represent information in a different way, rather than its motoric properties per se that really matter. Okay, now let me just end with one last thing. I have been talking about gesturing produced along with speech. which is how we usually do it. But there are times when we produce gesture without speech. And one of the questions that one of my students is starting to ask is whether gesture works in the same way when it's produced without speech. So just let me give you an example of this because it's pretty fascinating. This is a kid in India, I believe, who is doing abacus. And he's learned abacus and he's pretty good. He's getting to be close to expert. And he was asked to add up 10 two-digit numbers and to do it without the abacus, just to add it up. And this is what he does. So he puts in the answer and it's the right answer. It's pretty incredible. I mean, that he can add it up that quickly without the abacus there. He does it all with his hands. And so what we're trying to figure out is what are those gestures doing? Why is he doing them? But he does do them. And, is it having an effect? And why is it having an effect? Does it work the same as co-speech gestures? So that's where we're moving to next. So let me just end by thanking all my many collaborators. And thanking you for listening. So now we can open it up for questions. How's that? And I will stop sharing. Is that I think I will stop sharing.
No, thank you,
I see.
Susan.
Okay, I'm stopping sharing.
So let us start with the question answer session. I will go back to the question raised at 7:22. I start with Abhijit and go then to Dr. Bhavani. I just keep the order and so forth. So Abhijit was asking, what about adult learning as an action that is writing to learn and gestures and reading aloud to learn? Which one will be better? It's Abhijit's question. She is a PhD student, by the way. Abhijit, please activate your video if you can, and then Dr. Susan can also see you.
Hi. So there is evidence these days that writing is really effective, although it's a little controversial and now people are questioning it and talking about typing and things like that. So it really may be, that's the work that Karen Jones has done, showing that for children, at least, writing is more important. And I would guess it's the same for adults, but I don't know. We have just started to do work with adults learning chemistry to see whether gesturing predicts learning for adults learning stereoisomers as better than not gesturing, or the way in which you gesture, whether that predicts learning. And we're finding that it does. So, honestly, I don't think this is about kids and adults. I think this is really about learners. There may be an age very, very young when gesture isn't working exactly the same way. But after a certain point, pretty young point, I think gesture does the same thing for all of us. And it really matters what creates these mismatches is your understanding of the problem. If you understand it, if you're just on the edge of understanding it, you're going to produce mismatches. So if the problem is a kid problem, the kids will be mismatching. If it's a stereoisomers, the adults will be mismatching. So I think that's true. And we're beginning to do adult studies to actually find out if I'm right, if it really is the same.
I'll give you an example. I try learning both by writing. So what I do is I write and learn, but I also go in front of a mirror and I use gestures to reinforce my learning. So I think what works for me, I think, is writing and learning, because I could, yes. Thank you so much.
So the gestures don't write. Yeah. I think that's a nice study to do to see whether it is the writing. Now, writing is an action. It's true. I don't know. That's a good study to do. I don't know which is more important. We are trying to get in these stereoisomer studies, we've made people move the molecules around versus representing moving the molecules around versus imagining moving the molecules around. And right now, all three are working very well. So it might be that there's less difference for adult learning than for kid learning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abhijit, and also Dr. Susan. I would like to shift forward to Dr. Bhavani's question. She was asking both, or stating, both in Indian dancing and in Indian music, they give a lot of importance to gestures. In singing, they say gestures help you to hit the right notes. In dancing, the transmission of emotions and intention is conveyed primarily through gestures, followed by eyes, in brackets, line of sight. So, Susan, what would be your response to that?
I think that's the wonder. I mean, that's not really a question as much as an observation, and I completely agree with it. We have some, we've gotten some funding. It's not my work actually, but our Center for Gesture, Sign and Language has now gotten funding to study dance, and Indian dance is way up there in what we're studying because it's so representational in a way. Classical Indian dance, it's not just the movements, it's what the movements represent. So we're trying to think about dances like that versus, I don't know, other kinds of dance, maybe ballet, I don't know if ballet counts as non-representational, that are representing information a little less. And we're trying to explore the effect of these different kinds of movements. I think I think Indian dance is really, really interesting, and we could explore that and see what's going on there. There is some evidence that David Strauss, I think, I can't remember his name. That's not his name, but I'll think of it. He's looked at dance. This is a little different from what you're asking, but he's looked at learning dance and what is the most effective way to learn dance. So either you can imagine learning it, you're taught a movement and you imagine it. You're taught a movement and you do marking, which is a little like gesturing. You move your hands, but not your whole body, or you move your whole body as you dance. And what he found is that it was the middle one, the marking, that is most effective for retaining the dance, which isn't quite the question we've asked, but it is something that suggests that dance and gesture are not unrelated. They're really very much related, and we ought to think about both of them together.
And you actually use the gestures a lot to remember the dance. You just kind of, you do this and you remember the dance. It's always, people practice dance mentally with gestures, actually.
With their gestures, yeah. That's what he's been finding too. I think that's so interesting. There's something. I mean, I really wish we could we had some funding to go to India and study and whatever, but of course, COVID has prevented anything. But I think eventually, this group may do that. Very interesting question. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Bhavani and also Dr. Susan for this wonderful response. So I'm moving to Rasika, also one of our PhD students in the field of education, and she is asking, in mismatching gesture and speech, how do we know what actually the person wants to say, or is holding back, especially while interviewing someone? Question mark.
So I don't know, my gut feeling is that when you produce these mismatching gestures, you don't know you're doing it. Now, maybe at some unconscious level that you're holding back, but this is typically, not always, but typically the gesture is conveying knowledge that's a little bit more advanced than the speech. So you're still answering the problem wrong, but you do have a little bit of this correct knowledge. I don't know whether it's holding back. I would suspect not, but I'm not sure exactly how to explore that, like how to test that. I think this is a very interesting aspect of gesture, and I don't know if it matters. The fact that gesture is sort of under the radar, that people don't think about it. I think about it, but nobody else does. Think about the gestures other people produce and the gestures that you yourself produce. Now, we've sort of, that one of the reasons I went to manipulating gesture and telling people to gesture is to try to test that. And I thought that the whole effect would go away once you tell somebody to gesture, but it doesn't. So I may be just wrong about the implicitness of this. It may be that it doesn't matter at all. But I still think we're not very aware of how we gesture. If I make you aware of it, it doesn't seem to make a difference though, which is interesting actually.
Interesting, indeed. So Rasika, I hope your question, I'm sure your question got answered.
Yes, ma'am.
Maybe you can also show up shortly Yeah.
Ma'am, I just
again,
sorry, I just wanted to ask a question on this. For example,
you can activate your video, by the way, if you don't, if it's possible. I know sometimes it's not possible. Just
yeah,
invitation to do.
So. Hi, Dr. Susan. It's been very interesting to listening to your lecture, and I have been just glued on what you were speaking, and it was very engaging. And normally I have a lot of questions when I listen to something. I really tend to critically think, and also the question was, we should go to field, and like my past experience tells me, when I went to the field, people want to say something, especially when we interview the not so educated or marginalized people who do not know how to articulate. Then basically use their gestures or hands, but there is always a mismatch between what they want to say and their gestures. And how do we decipher about it? Or I mean, what should we look at? Look at their hands or hear their speech?
I think both. Absolutely both, and take the relationship between the two into account. Sometimes it's real. I think that when we're spontaneously listening, we always take the information from gesture into account, but we don't know we're doing it. So my guess is you're doing that anyhow. But it may be good as a researcher to notice that this bit of information came from gesture and this bit of information came from speech, because they may be less aware that they know the stuff that's coming from gesture than they are aware. They're more aware that they know the stuff that's coming from the mouth. So I would absolutely pay attention to both. I mean, I'm advocating paying attention to gesture all the time. Everybody pays attention to speech, but we don't want to ignore speech either. We really want to think about both of them and think about integrating. That's really very interesting. I mean, if you could do a video of that, you can then go back later and to look at it's very hard to interpret online. I think let me say, you interpret it online automatically, but it's very hard to pull it apart and figure out what each gesture is doing. So if you could videotape it, that would be really...
the most perplexing thing is the gesture, what they don't want to say. They say something else. Yes, they gesture something else. So I've always been confused, and then it always comes to whether I'm collecting the correct data or whether I'm interpreting it right, or whether my bias also comes in when I try to interpret their gestures.
Yeah, so that's very, very interesting. When I study these kids, it's clear that, I mean, they don't have any strong feelings about math. They're not holding back their knowledge of math. But when you talk about sensitive topics, that people may be holding back, either consciously or unconsciously. Yes. So I have a student, Anjana Chandran, who is studying socially motivated gestures. And she's looking at, for example, if you ask somebody to talk about men versus women and whether they are equally competent at leading or something like that. And a person will say, they are, absolutely, they're the same. But when they talk about men's leadership styles, they sort of gesture up here. And when they're talking about women's leadership styles, they're gesturing down here. So, they think, oh yeah, it's the same, and I truly believe that, but at some level in their body, they don't believe that. And I don't know whether they're trying to hold that back or whether they really don't know they have that belief. I think that's an interesting question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Susan. It was really enlightening, and I'm also looking forward to the questions, because I think much of my questions also relate to the questions in the chat box. So thank you so much again.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Rasika. I would like to invite Sur to ask his question. I'm scanning the chat box. I know you have asked it, but I can't find it. My apologies. So if your question is still there, please ask it.
Not sure I had the question. First of all, thank you so much for the wonderful, it's amazing lecture. Many things that I was not aware of that I should have been. I come from the computational approach. there are a couple of things that kind of maybe comments. First, regarding the two hands, maybe a control group that uses one hand would also be useful there.
Yeah.
That's just a side note.
Yeah.
And another thing is that computational scientists are doing speech recognition, NLP, and I have not seen any work, although it comes from another perspective of computer vision that can actually analyze gestures in a quite a spectacular way. I've never seen works that try to combine both modalities, if they are. Have you seen anything related to that? And finally, so that's a good thing for us. And finally, how do you relate that to teaching? Meaning, what if the teacher is not capable of doing the right gestures? Would that be impactful for the child or for the adult? Is that something that's been studied?
Let me take a computational question first, because that's quick. People are definitely starting to look at how gesture can be, whether we can automatically process gesture, whether the machine can do it. We're making, not we, I'm not doing this, but somebody, people are making slow progress in that. And I think they're going to have to do that before they can integrate the two, but maybe not. I mean, maybe it is better to take them both at the same time. I think that's an interesting area that I'm watching, but not participating in. With respect to teaching, it's interesting to me because I think that if you know what you're talking about as a teacher, you'll produce the right gestures. I mean, this really is a reflection of what you know. So I think the problem comes in if a teacher doesn't truly understand what they're talking about, then their gestures may belie their misconceptions. But I think if a teacher really knows what they're saying, they might not gesture, but they probably will if it's a math task or something like that, or science, because it's hard to talk about these things without gesturing. And if they're gesturing, their gestures are going to be on target. So I have faith in teachers, as long as they know what they're teaching, which is the most important thing, not the gestures, but that they know what they're teaching.
Thank you so much for that.
So we have a follow-up question from Dr. Wavani. She is asking, is there any other modality other than speech and gesture?
That's important. Yeah, well, people have looked at drawing. And I've been trying to, been talking to people about how to compare. Gesture and drawing are comparable in the sense that they're both visual. Drawing, of course, sticks around. It's permanent, not permanent, but it's there. It stays there, whereas gesture drops away. And so they might really differ in their effect on learning. And we had planned some studies to look at how gesture and drawing come together and affect learning, but we haven't really done it. Where gesture has to be integrated with speech naturally, and drawing pictures don't. They don't have a natural going together with speech, whereas gesture does. So it might have an advantage there. And maybe fading away is a good thing, in the sense that if I'm gesturing something and I gesture something wrong, it doesn't sort of stay there staring me in the face for a very long time. But I don't know about the good parts and the bad parts of drawing versus gesture. So that's one possibility for different modalities. There is also, interestingly, we've looked at gesture and hand languages, like sign languages. But there's a group, Diane Brentari and Tara Edwards, who are beginning to study tactile languages in deaf-blind people. And what they do is they use both of their hands. Both people use both hands, and they are touching the shapes of the hands. It's really interesting. And what Brentari and Edwards are finding is that even in this very, very different modality, you see some of the same kinds of structures that you see in language, in spoken language and in sign language. which is just amazing. It's just.
I was going to ask about tactile actually, because we work in haptics, so it has got to do with touch. And we usually consider that as the third modality, but I was just wondering if it has any place in regular life, apart from exceptional, when you see physical skills and or for people who are blind. I'm just wondering.
Right. Well, that work is really, really interesting. And I have a graduate student right now who's finishing, and she wants to work with Tara Edwards to study deafblind children and how they acquire this language, which really could be fascinating, just sort of some of their, but we're not there yet. She's working on it. They have found some though, to begin to study. Because this language is so interesting because it was created by the deafblind, as I think the deafblind people themselves. When sighted people do this, what they do is they take American Sign Language and they hold the hands of a deafblind person and they, do sign language into the hand. And that's much less effective, apparently, than this pro-tactile language that they're inventing themselves. It's really, it's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Susan, we are at the end officially, but we would have 3 more questions. The question from my side would be, do we have space for that 3 questions or 3 persons to ask? Wonderful, thank you.
Sure.
Then I'm moving forward to Dr. Praveen's follow-up question. So there is, it is posted that the children who are selected in the study are children who are similar age group. Could there be developmental differences in understanding gesture between the groups or demographic differences?
Right. Yeah, they all are around the same age because we wanted them not to be understanding the problem. But we have our conservation studies are on younger kids, and our word learning studies are on younger kids still. So I think this does cut across all ages. Now, and it really relates to how well you understand the problem that you're explaining or working with or trying to learn, not your gesturing ability. I think that there may be a developmental moment. So when kids are very, very young, they almost use gestures as instead of a lexical item. So really little kids, will point at something and say a word, point at the hat and say mommy. And that actually forms 2 sentences. We tend to not do that as adults. Our gestures are coming along with speech, and they don't replace a lexical item. They added propositional information. So when kids get beyond that point, that may be a real turning point in the role that gesture is playing. But that's happening, I think, pretty young. And after that, I don't think there are very many developmental differences in gesturing. Of course, it's up to me to prove that, and I haven't yet done that. I think some of the work that we're doing on adults to explore the same effects that we find in children will address that question. If we find differences, then of course we do need to look for a developmental path. But I'm not betting on it. I just don't think that there are that many differences. But there may be. I may be wrong.
Yeah, I was just wondering of this because sometimes I find myself missing certain gestures, and I'm just wondering if, early development, if they're used to, gestures in certain demographics, maybe they're more used to it. And so you're kind of like getting yourself hardwired for that. And so you're inherently able to.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually. We know so little about individual differences between people who gesture or don't gesture, whatever. It's argued that cultures are very different, that Italians gesture a lot and Swedes gesture very little. But actually, in the work that's been done to try to test that, it doesn't look like that's true. What's different is that Italians gesture big, they're right out there and they have a lot of emblems, and Swedes tend to gesture down here. But it isn't the case that the cultural rate is that different. On the other hand, we don't know about individual differences. And there really may be individual differences in how much you do gesture and how much you appreciate it and how much you can profit from it. And that's, I think, is a place that really requires new research. We just don't know. But I think it's a good place to look. I really do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Praveen. So then next question is from Dr. Sophia. Have you ever looked at whether mirror neurons are involved when we observe other people's gestures?
Yeah. It certainly feels like that would be the right place to look. I mean, I'm not a neurological type here, so I can't really speak to that, but I think it's a great question to ask. And it feels like a mechanism that might work very well, particularly since, as I'm gesturing, as I watch your gestures, I sort of use my own motor system. Now, I don't know, and there is a fair amount of synchrony in gestures. So David McNeil has looked at this, two people who are friends who are talking end up mimicking, one mimics the other's gestures, which suggests that maybe there is some sort of mirroring going on, but I haven't looked at it. And I don't know that anybody else has looked at mirror neurons, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Our last colleague and at the same time PhD scholar is Rondine. Rondine, you have a couple of posts or two. Do you just share that what you would like to prioritize it? So, or I just read it out then for you. Okay, you unmuted yourself. Wonderful. Please go ahead.
No, I was just following up on the Indian dance topic. By the way, thank you, Doctor. Very nice and interesting talk. Not only academically, but also just everyday sort of stuff. So yeah, I was commenting on the Indian dance. I was saying that it's actually some of the gestures are laid out in the scriptures in the so they're pretty much they tell you how to move the eyes, what to do to create this sort of impression, this awe of God, or this playful flirting with the cowgirls or something. So in that way, it's not, it would seem then that that gestures are not authentic individual expressions according to these scriptures, but they're sort of laid out what sort of gesture you should make in what sort of given situation. But it doesn't seem like that is how it should, that is really in reality what it is, so, according to you.
Yeah, I think that's, that's a problem that we have in our own studies. So, and I agree with you that once you're told to move in that way, it doesn't quite feel like a gesture because it's not a natural expression of you. And when we tell children to move their hands in this way, it's not really a gesture to start. But one of the things we're finding is that over this training period, some children do learn and some children don't. And, we're telling them to move in this way and do all of that sort of stuff. What we're finding is that the children who end up learning are the ones who sort of change their gestures over time. And they sort of incorporate them into their own system, into their own way of thinking, so that they move more quickly from the 2 to the 1. And they change over this 6 or 7 or 8 problems, and the non-learners don't. So one possibility here is that when you read these scriptures and you learn how to do the gestures, that you do incorporate them into how you're thinking and how you're believing and how you're dancing. And you really do change the way you think about it as a function of making these movements. I'm not sure how you test that. I mean, it would be sort of interesting if some people who are better dancers than others were the ones who incorporated those gestures into their own selves. I'm not sure how to test it, but I think that's an interesting point, and I think it could be an interesting place to study.
That's kind of exactly what I wrote, because I've learned dance, and at some point of time, these gestures are not forced. They just become a part of you. Mm-hmm. And the way you express a gesture is kind of unique to each dancer. You may learn a particular gesture, but how it actually comes out and how you move it and how it becomes your expression, and it expresses the emotion and maybe not a thought, but it expresses an emotion for sure.
Right,
That's what makes the artist an artist, is how you make that expression. And it
Right. Yeah, I think that this would be a really interesting place to explore the same phenomenon that we're trying to explore in this learning situation. You know, taking in these movements that somebody has taught you and making them your own, and making them, you know, a form of expression. And there's probably individual differences in this. There certainly are in the learning situation, and those would be interesting to explore.
Music, however, is subtle. And in music, when they teach you to music, they actually ask you to use your hands, but they don't teach you what to do. So for example, if you're going high, your hands go higher, but how you move your hands is up to you. So you have different singers who will use the gesture in different ways, but it's like when they're hitting the notes or they want to sustain a note, their hands actually reflect how they sing, and it comes naturally as you sing it. It becomes a part of your body expression, your body language, so to speak.
Right. So this is just this really is we have this funding that I was saying from the Neubauer Foundation to study this in Indian dance. So maybe someday we can actually do this. We've not been doing much last year because it's been hard, but in the future, let's keep it in mind.
Please come and visit us when you decide to come to India too.
Okay, that would be wonderful.
So it's recorded. This session is, by the way, recorded, so we will surely come back to that. So now, coming to the end, I would like to invite Dr. Sid to share last thoughts and a takeaway, maybe to you, Dr. Susan, to all of us. And then I would kindly request also Dr. Awani to close up the session with a prayer. And I want to thank to everyone and to you also, Dr. Susan. I mute myself now, and I wish you all the best. Hopefully see you soon.
Thank you. You're muted.
You said I'm muted.
I did.
So a couple of things. One is Bhavani mentioned something about a minute before. I wrote to myself about emotions, and certainly in spoken language, emotions are expressed, and as you're expressing them, your emotions can change or get stronger and whatever. I'm just wondering if, and you don't have to answer it because it's really taking it away from the main thing you were talking about. But if anybody's been looking at the place of emotions in gestures, and it probably isn't just how flamboyant it is, like the Italians versus the Swedes, so that was one thing. A second thing is just a personal anecdote of something that happened to me many years ago. I was trying to solve some kind of a developmental problem. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out what was happening. There were 5 or 6 somethings that were changing over time. And I just couldn't see how they were going together. And I really got obsessive about it, compulsive, and couldn't do anything to solve the problem. Afterwards, I realized that as I was talking to people about it, thinking that maybe I'll be able to solve the problem if I talk about it or get some ideas, this is what I did. I talked like this. And I didn't know it. I didn't do it on purpose. And I didn't even pay that much. I did pay a little attention to it, but well, it turns out that there were 2 systems that were developing, and they were developing at different rates. And I had an assumption that they were going to be developing at the same rate. And so this was like different rates of changes that were taking place. And they had anticipated by months. When I finally understood what it was, that how I could solve the problem they had. So there's that. But here's a question I would like you to address, and if you want to, and that is, Where does all this come from? Now we're talking about, it's like, you know, I don't have to tell you developmental psychology, we're always interested in sources. What are the sources of whatever it is that you're looking at? And we're talking here about the structure of spoken language, the structure of signed language, the structure of gestures. So there's something, and they're different, but there are similarities. And where did they come from developmentally? What is at the beginning? I mean, maybe there are different systems from the beginning, or maybe there's something like a primordial goop. And then from that, different parts start coming out. And maybe there are different similar developmental courses for them. Maybe over different time periods, but there might be similar developmental courses. So in a word, what's going on here?
Yeah, so I have lots of thoughts about that. David McNeil has talked about evolution of language, and he's somebody who believes that gesture and speech began together, that it was never gesture first or speech first. They began together and they evolved together as a system over evolutionary time. And that might be correct. Interestingly, when we look at home signers, that is the deaf kids who are developing their own gesture systems and not being taught sign language, when they first start using their hands, they start doing things categorically. They don't use the image. I mean, it's all iconic. It all has to be iconic, but it's much more discrete and categorical than you might have expected. You might have expected them to be mimetic, because that seems like the easy thing to do, but that's not what they do. They do things that are categorical. And one of the things that I'm beginning to be interested in is, when do they start bringing in this gestural component? So that's a person who's having to create language on his own in this modern day world. It's not the evolution of language. It's really the development of language. It's not even development of language. It's the creation of language. But I do believe that a lot of this comes from us, in the sense that, you know, if you wipe language out, we're going to bring it back, because it is as much of us, you know, it's the way we communicate. We will reinvent language. And I think these deaf kids make it clear that we will reinvent language. And I think what we first do is do this categorical stuff, but then I would guess quickly we bring in the imagistic as well, because it's a very important component. So important that, you know, David thinks it's been there from the very beginning, and he's writing a book to prove that. It's coming out soon, I hope. So I don't know if that's a full answer. That I've got lots of thoughts about that. I think they're great questions. They're good questions.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. So two other things. One is, so Susan is teaching at the University of Chicago, which is, it's on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood called Hyde Park. When I was a child growing up in the United States, I lived in Hyde Park. And yeah.
And you have a Chicago accent. Do you know that? You have a Chicago accent.
Still, okay. Yeah. Can't get
I'm not surprised you grew up in Hyde
Park. So it was 53rd and Greenwood, and then 51st in the university. That's where we lived in apartments there. So there's yet another connection. But something I did not mention in the beginning, which I will mention now, and that is that among the many awards for her intellectual and scientific accomplishments that Susan has received, she has also received awards in teaching. And I think that we just saw why. And it was really a tour de force. You took us through your thinking about these kinds of problems. You saw what the interest was in it. And in and of itself, it's interesting, the work that you're doing, but no less is the way that you presented it, so that we could get infected by your intellect and your emotions, and about the really big problems that you're trying to solve. And you did it in such a way that you really taught us about topics that we might have thought about maybe, and maybe even that. And you did it in such a wonderful way. So, Susan, thank you again. I started with thank you for coming and for spending time with us and for enlightening us about problems that you've been dealing with. You said in the beginning, I'm not sure if this is really going to be very helpful for the kinds of things that are being done at Amrita University and AMMACHI Labs, etc. But it obviously has, it's resonated with the people who were here. So thank you for that. And when COVID is over and it gets harnessed and travel is possible, and if there's any way you can come to India, I'll just say what everybody else has said before, and that would be, it would be wonderful if you could come and visit. You'll see a most amazing university, which has not just lip service, science in the service of humanity and human beings. So thank you again.
I would love to. That would be really fun. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and all of your questions. So thank you for inviting me.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Dr. Bhavani, kindly would you close up with a prayer so that we formally close up the session?
Thank you. And I think everybody is putting it, their thanks into the chat. Thank you so much. And again, so please, you're most welcome. Please come to India, and we'll make sure that Sid is also over here so that we can have we all will have a really wonderful time. I'll start with the closing prayers now. Om Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. It means
thank you,
all
thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been
Thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
I think everyone can turn on their quick videos quickly and just say bye-bye.
So nice to see people, actually. It's really hard to do it without. Okay, thank you all. Nice to meet you all. I hope to see you in person someday. Be nice.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you all.